Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. After almost 16 years at the helm of Europe's largest economy, Angela Merkel will step down as Germany's Chancellor once a new government is formed after federal elections on September 26th. As one of the world's most influential leaders, Angela Merkel will leave her indelible mark on Germany, Europe, and also global affairs. Just a few days till the election, Germany's Social Democratic Party is the frontrunner, while the center-left SPD's popularity has risen since August. So who will likely succeed Ms. Merkel? And which parties will take the reins of government? Let's loop in our panelists, and they have quite some very different views. For the German election and Merkel's legacy in Berlin, we're joined by Ulrich Bruckner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. In Chapel Hill, United States, Klaus Lauritz, originally from Germany. He's a distinguished professor of history and international affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Last in Beijing, not least, Mr. Mao Mingqiao, assistant professor, fellow at the Center for German Studies with Peking University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. Let me start by asking you about the significance of this election. I'm sure the two Germans who are with us today knows it really to the core of it. So Professor Lauritz, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's of course significant. If any chancellor leaves office after 16 years, the new era will begin. And the wonderful thing is that Angela Merkel decided to leave herself. She wasn't booted out by the electorate. She didn't lose an election, but she decided that after 16 years in power, it's enough. She wants to retire, and apparently she doesn't want to have another political job, be it in Germany or internationally. So this clearly will begin a new era.
Mr. Bruckner, though, her leaving the post at this critical juncture made a lot of people worry. Of course, any politician would have the time to be in the position and also at the time to leave the chair. But what do you make of the reality?
Well, it is a crucial moment for Germany. Whether it's a new era remains to be seen, because it can also be that we start a new situation in which we don't know how long the next chancellor will be in office or how long it's going to take to form a new coalition. Faces like a Helmut Kohl government of 15 years and Merkel with 16 years are so unusual in Western-type democratic systems that I'm quite skeptical whether we see something like a new era happening after that.
Why?
Because we have a more diversified society, and societies that become more and more diverse and not homogeneous react on the different programs that are offered in a parliamentarian democracy. Parties try to mobilize different classes, different groups of people, different levels of education, but there is no such thing like either you are working class and you go for the Social Democrats, or you're conservative and then it's kind of a family thing for generations to vote for the same party. This is no longer happening. You can be a conservative and vote for the environment as a green supporter. It's no longer the exact opposite of what the CDU stands for. And therefore you have so many more choices and also more parties that could form a coalition.
This is a new era, isn't it? We can say that Merkel is basically an outgoing era, that another chancellor who lasted for 16 years is unlikely, that we have a totally new scenario with many more parties involved, many more new issues involved, which all have to be considered, so that the era of stability and reliability under Merkel may be also a little bit of a more boring era, which was dominated by just one chancellor, but that is coming to an end. So that is a new era. It might be a more uncertain era, a more unstable era, but I do think that something really new is going to begin.
The newer thing will be the
my
better thing?
understanding of an era is rather that you have the same person in charge. If the era is the opposite of sort of continuity, then I totally agree.
Well, we see all the two Germans are exactly like the German. They are debating about the election already. I remember very clearly covering the last election in Germany, in Berlin, in fact, and going into any coffee shop, everybody is talking about the election. Certainly the awareness about the election and the political rights are extremely high. But what does that mean? This change, whether you call it an era or a change of the individual. Mr. Mao, from your perspective, what is your observation?
Well, I don't think there's any change at all. I mean, maybe that of course, we'll have a new chancellor from September.
Yeah.
Merkel will step up willingly from her office. But if you look at the election campaign, you can see the whole theme is about who is going to carry on Merkel's legacy and who is going to go on with the set course of Angela Merkel. You start with Armin Laschet, who's acting now like Merkel's best baby kid. And on the other hand, you have Olaf Scholz, who's posting in Merkel's gesture, telling the voters that I am the one that is capable of doing what Merkel has done in the last 16 years. So I would say that at least on social themes, on social topics, and what the German internal affairs is concerned, we will see a great continuity, even in the next administration.
One of the things that we need to really talk about is the role of Germany on the European continent, for example, within the EU. Now we see France, as a result of the latest U.S. decision to sell nuclear subs to some of the U.S. allies, have been making quite clear statements about the future. Now, Germany's role will becoming even more important in this case as to where Europe is going.
You mentioned about the France and the submarine deal France once had with Australia, and now the France is calling out the strategic autonomy within the European Union. I think that is exactly Merkel stands for, the strategic autonomy. On the one hand, she enhances the transatlantic partnership with the United States, but on the other hand, she struck a deal with Russia despite of ideological differences. And this Nord Stream 2 project does not only ensure Germany's energy autonomy, but also its strategic autonomy in the international politics. So that is the reason why Chancellor Merkel is so successful, both internally and internationally.
Professor Bruckner, about the future of Europe, particularly with all the latest geopolitical change. I know Germany has been struggling to make that role with the leadership of Angela Merkel. Now, with a less experienced international player, will Germany still be where it is, or it's likely to change?
With regard to what has been said before about the perception of Germany, if you look back how the performance of Germany was before Merkel came into office, a lot has been improved in terms of the reputation or the nation branding of the country. That it is more likable, people have a very positive opinion about Germany and its achievements, and also her style as a leader, which does not necessarily mean that Merkel is eager to lead. And that makes it difficult in times in which, different from the 1990s, when a lot of countries were afraid of a unified Germany could act unilaterally and more in its self-interest. Now the fear is much greater that Germany could not have enough appetite for leadership or to invest in what Professor Mao called a strategic autonomy or a stronger European integration. That has to do with a competition of different narratives about what this leadership implies or what strategic autonomy requires. And France has a very clear idea what that means, but France isn't strong enough to push it through and to modernize the European Union according to French priorities. And this is another weakness, I would say, from the Merkel years, that she did not sufficiently support Macron. And therefore, I disagree with Professor Mao about the state of strategic autonomy of the European Union, which is far from ideal.
Mr. Mao, respond, please.
Well, I think that Merkel is leading by example. She sets an example of how Germany could balance between a value-based and interest-based foreign policies. So I think if she or her successor could transmit this to the European Union on a greater level, on a higher level, this could be a good example of how European Union is going to position itself between, let's say, the geopolitical power balance.
This is an absolutely fascinating discussion. Professor Laris, I also want you to comment on this point.
Yeah, there have been two recent crises in relations with the United States, as you know, the abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan and now recently the submarine deal with Australia. In both cases, the European Union, or in the latter case, France, was not consulted at all. That has led to a lot of annoyance and anger on the European continent, in the whole EU, and even a lot of concern in Germany. So that explains the calls for an increased strategic autonomy, a European army, more European military efforts, and so on. But we should not overlook that this is an elite obsession. This is not necessarily reflected by the will and interest of the German people. So the population is not really in support of spending a lot more money on the military, having something like strategic autonomy. And so Merkel and Macron largely agree. So Macron pushes that much harder than Merkel has ever done. Right. Whether that can be realized in the future must be seen. That really depends on whether the new Chancellor can persuade his people, public opinion, that strategic autonomy, a European military effort and a European army is really worthwhile doing. And this is still very much an open question.
Let me move on to another question about Germany's relations with China. A lot of the Chinese that I've been talking to are having quite good impressions, in fact, about Angela Merkel, not necessarily about her fashion style, but very much about her policy style. For example, about the pandemic, which this part of the world are very concerned and have been practicing zero tolerance, so to speak, policy. And they saw a strong leadership inside Germany about vaccination, about fight against the pandemic, about multilateralism in this fight. So that, to the outsiders of your country, is extremely impressive. But will that change? And that certainly is a domestic issue. That's a hotspot issue for every country right now. Professor Laris, briefly from you, before I move on to your German counterpart who usually do not agree with you. So go ahead, sir. You have the first point.
I think that in all likelihood that is going to continue. German efficiency in inverted commas or skills of organization, I think that runs throughout the political elite, and Laschet and Scholz will also try to represent that. As far as German-Chinese relations are concerned, there's been a policy of engagement under Angela Merkel, both in the economic sphere, of course. China is a very important export market for Germany, but also politically, because Merkel, and I think the whole German political elite believes that you engage with another power in order to arrive at compromises, maybe to persuade the other power to change its political behavior to some extent, the way you want it and you see it. So that kind of style of engagement, both politically and economically, I can see that will continue.
Yeah, Professor Buchner.
I agree.
You agree? Oh, wow.
I agree. Yeah,
all right.
I agree.
Go ahead.
We are a country that is based on the rule of law, and people trust in norms and standards, and we wait at traffic lights in the night, no matter if a car is coming or not.
Wow.
So this is a very German thing, and it doesn't matter who is currently in power, because the mechanism of policy making continues to exist. This is both true for Germany as well as for policy making in the European Union. If we trust in institutions, things will continue. So there is sort of a stabilizing factor that also supports what Professor Mao said in the beginning, that there is a certain dimension of continuity. But when we think of China, Germany is currently pushed by the United States to take sides. And I don't think that this happy leading by example attitude and preaching multilateralism can be practically continued, because we will be forced to deliver and to not only fulfill our 2% GDP goal of NATO to
yeah.
spend more on defense,
Yeah.
but also to be actively engaged and to take responsibility. And this will be something that does not allow any future chancellor to just treat China as a nice trading partner who's also a bit of a competitor, but we are in a global competition in geopolitics about what is the future leading model. And in this leading model, we put the human being, the individual with human rights at the heart of everything. The United States stand more for a neoliberal project of let markets do what markets can do best. And China represents a system in which the Communist Party tells the people what to do. And these are three very different models. And in a shrinking world, the competition will become more fierce, no matter if you have a nice guy in the German Chancellery or not.
Okay.
Here I may disagree, if I may just come in. I think Germany has a reputation of ignoring its national interests and basically doing what other people want it to do, be it the United States, France, or other countries. I don't think this is always correct. When you look at Nord Stream 2, the Germans, despite all pressure on the Merkel government by the European Union, by the United States, by many other countries, they still stuck to it. And in the end, Biden agreed that Nord Stream 2 would be acceptable and could be finished. So if it comes to the national interest, the Germans at least sometimes can insist on their own advantage. And I think we may see that with China, that engagement with China, particularly economically, is highly important to Germany. And I cannot see that the United States or other European Union countries can push Germany away from that. They know what is to their advantage to some extent. So I think, Germany in the post-Merkel era will probably try to continue its role of mediator and balancer between China and the United States, and that may well be a good thing.
Okay, this is fascinating. I really want to continue our conversation. There's one factor that we haven't talked about. Since a lot of you talk about ideas and principles, there's one idea when it comes to international relations these days that is very much in focus, also in focus at the ongoing UN General Assembly, whether multilateralism is still the key word here. And that applies to every country to choose right now. We saw some countries use words, for example, partners and allies, but not necessarily multilateralism anymore. And yet, for many others, Germany included, in previous speeches given by the current chancellor, multilateralism is the principle that Germany still holds on to. So that is a very much, if you're talking about choices to be made, a clear choice that countries have to make, including Germany. Professor Bruckner, you go first, and then Professor Laris and Professor Mao, please.
Yeah, we have a strong verbal commitment to multilateralism that became even more intense in the Trump years. But it's one thing to preach it and to sort of practice it on a European level, because the EU is a perfect example of applied multilateralism. But what was praised by Professor Mao as a perfect example of leading by example with Nord Stream can also be read as unilateral action without consulting partners. Merkel did what she wanted, or the government did, to continue with what Schröder has started with. And the same happened in the migration crisis, in which Merkel suddenly discovered her humanitarian heart and supported people in need, which was strongly supported by the German public. But no one was consulted in the rest of the European Union, which had a very different attitude towards should migration policy be a competence of the European Union, and shall we distribute more than 1 million refugees in countries that have no experience with it?
If I interpret what you're trying to say, is that Germany has been practicing selective multilateralism from day one?
Germany is preaching multilateralism, but we find a number of unilateral acts that are strictly in deeds the opposite of what multilateralism implies theoretically.
But let me go to Professor Laris, please. Professor.
Yeah, the selective multilateralism is, of course, that what most countries in the world do. No one is totally multilateral or, fully sticks out
But
to the.
there is a difference, Professor Larry. So we cannot just push things to either 0 or 100, right?
Let me just say,
there is a difference
but
between whether you have that as an aspiration or you totally dismiss it as a principle,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. No, the Germans have a strong multilateral conviction. And I would say most countries in the world outside the superpower realm, the United States, China, perhaps Russia, they can afford to perhaps dismiss multilateralism more easily because they're strong enough to go it their own way. For a middle power like Germany, this is hardly ever possible. Okay. Also, when you look at the European Union, of course, French-German cooperation is highly important, but they actually can't do it by themselves. They need other countries like Poland or Italy to be on their side, to be able to push things through. So multilateralism will continue. It might be selective at times, because countries are also selfish, work in their national interest. But on the whole, the future German Chancellor will also be a multilateralist. Okay. Germany is simply a much smaller country. It is not as influential as the United States. It cannot do things big powers like the United States or China or Russia can afford to do.
Well, you are probably too much dismissing yourself, it seems, at least in our eyes. But Mr. Mao, go ahead, Mr. Mao.
Well, that's the German debating culture.
Indeed,
continues disagrees with each other. So multilateralism, I oddly agree with both of them that Germany is committed to multilateralism. But in my opinion, multilateralism is more about not shutting others out, just involving others in the position-making process. That does not mean that we cannot have like bilateral partnership with other countries, with specific countries. That is exactly what Merkel has in her 16 years have done. Take China as example. Professor Bruckner had just talked about the power of institutions and how the institutions can be a factor of stability, even in the after Merkel era. I just want to mention a few, like Merkel have helped establish the high-level dialogues mechanism between the two Chinese and German governments. That Merkel has left, that is her legacy to the multilateral commitment with, if you take China as example, with this partnership with China, and that explains what I have mentioned, her balance between the interest-based and value-based foreign policies.
I see.
She didn't pick sides. She just stand in the middle and tried to be the mediator, which in that point I agree with Mr. Larry's. Also,
good.
Finally, we have some shared points.
Right. I mean, it's wonderful that you agree and you agree to disagree. Thank you so much, Ulrich Bruckner, Klaus Larry, and Mao Mingqiao. Really appreciate it.